Hello, welcome everyone. You're very welcome to move forward if you want to. This is the fourth installment of the Decolonizing Europe lecture series, which happens in connection with both the direct course on Decolonizing Europe and the working group on race, migration, and coloniality in Europe, which is open to anyone interested. We do have the website on the European Studies Council, part of the Macmillan website. So if you're not part of the group yet and are interested in joining, either talk to Tim here or send us an email. So very briefly, since most of you, I think, already know as a background, the idea behind the lecture series and the class and the working group is to explore which role Europe might play in a decolonized world that requires the deprogramming of all of us from a lot of what is understood as modernity, but which is in fact very much European modernity. So what we are interested in is exploring thinkers, activists, artists who address this question, looking at the long-term impact of colonialism on Europe and on counter models. So most of the people who I've invited for this series are from Europe, are all racialized people from Europe, which I think is no coincidence. That is a particular positionality that invites decolonial thinking. One of the differences between the US and Europe is that while both are very much shaped by whiteness, the naming of whiteness is something that is not yet very common in Europe and produces a lot of resistance, as we saw at last week's event. Today's event is very interesting and exciting to me for various reasons. All of the speakers I invited are people who I really want to engage with, but those people are some of those folks with whom I've been engaging with for the longest, more than 30 years. They are also representing here a project that we all are part of, that will include Yale, and that will continue next semester with, among other things, a symposium. So these four wonderful people here are, among many other things that they do, with me, the PIs of the Intersectional Black European Studies project. And that's what they'll talk to you about today. So please help me welcome.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation to Professor EI-Tayeb, dear Fatima. I hope I'm still, can I still be seen by the Zoom people, or do I have to actually sit down?
No,
I'm looking at, good, okay. So also hello to people of Zoom. We have 7 slides today, and I'm going to start very shortly by introducing our panel and the contributors for the principal investigators in this project, the Intersectional Black European Studies project. So it's a Black queer feminist collaboration housed at the Technical University in Berlin, at the Center for Educational Justice in Berlin, the RAA Berlin, and at Yale University here in New Haven. And it's funded by a grant from the Senate, from the Parliament, State Parliament of the state of Berlin in Germany. So very shortly, you can see who we are here. I am Maisha Auma, it's in alphabetical order. And then to my right is Dr. Denise Bergold-Caldwell. Then Fatima EI-Tayeb just did the introduction and invited us. And then on the farther right is, on the outside of the circle, I'm not going to say anything about farther. On the outside of the circle is Katja Kinder. And then next to Katja Kinder's left is Peggy Pische. And you can see a little bit about our biography here. We can also say a sentence or two about ourselves, because we are all going to give you a short perspective or an impulse about what this Intersectional Black European Studies project is. My background is education and gender studies. Childhood and difference has been the area in which I have worked in until last year. And right now I'm working on intersectional diversity studies. So, my role is to give you an idea of why we chose this frame, radically inclusive archives, and why we are trying to frame intersectional Black European studies as a project that's radically inclusive. Immediately after I speak, Peggy Pische is going to speak about Best Black European Studies, which was a project initiated by Peggy Pische, Professor EI-Tayeb, Fatima EI-Tayeb, Professor Sarah Lennox, who's now emeritus, and also Professor Randolph Oxman, one of the first Black German professors in Germany. He was professor at University of Mainz, which is relevant for the mapping and our archives of Black academics in German-speaking countries. And Peggy is going to give us a short idea of coming from BEST to InBEST, so from Black European Studies to Intersectional Black European Studies. What I'm going to do very shortly is actually give you just 3 lines of thinking around why we're calling it radically inclusive archives. And our point of departure is about confronting limitations. So we are framing it as missing in archives, and it's a spin-off of missing in literature, about groups with little social power and how we don't find ourselves represented or underrepresented in literature, for example, and we're also underrepresented in archives. And that's the idea of missing in archives. So here, the work of Olutimehine Adegbeye, and especially from her TED Talk, this is a young queer African writer, and she has this TED Talk called Who Belongs in the City? So this idea of who belongs, but more importantly, how do we know we belong? How do we know we belong in processes of archiving and also in the results of archives? And there's already an archive of Best Black European Studies since Fatima, Peggy, Sarah, and in collaboration with Randolph initiated this project. And institutionally, there are archives in the North American space. So the North American space actually has chairs for Black European Studies, or chairs with this denomination, Black European Studies, while we in German-speaking countries do not have a single chair for Black European Studies. So that's also the element of missing. In archives, it has a geopolitical dimension. And Olutimehine Adegbeye in her talk talks about the idea of shared cities. So we borrowed this idea to speak about shared archives, shared knowledge production and documentation and distribution, and shared resources in the process of making intersectional Black European studies inclusive, radically inclusive. And maybe you will hear behind that there was this debate in feminist scholarship about, do we need strategies of recognition or strategies of redistribution to achieve equality? And we're saying we need both. We need both. So this is Nancy Fraser and co. We need both recognition and distribution. Conventional archives mirror the colonial archive more than they contribute to building a decolonial present. I'm going to show the reference in the next slide. This is work from feminist Africans, people working on feminist Black queer feminist scholarship, geopolitically with a sense of complexity of Blackness, and working in the context of the online journal Feminist Africa. That's why I borrowed the term Feminist Africans. So we have to question the content and circulation of conventional archives with regard to the reproduction of coloniality, of racialized hierarchies, and also of exclusion. But before we can actualize our radically inclusive vision, we must face, we must confront, we must shift existing realities of exclusion. And again, a reminder that exclusion doesn't just happen. Exclusion is active, it's an ongoing process, it's enforced, and then it's normalized by all of us. And so all of us have to shift to enable more radical inclusivity. And that's a reference to the article, to the TED Talk by Olutimehin Adigbe at the end of my slide. Moving on. We're now at the second line of thought I want to open. There's three as a total, as a reminder. So our perspective is based on feminist African critiques of archiving structures, of archiving norms, and archiving practices. And just to break it down a little bit, here's a critique of conventional archiving and conventional history making. So conventional history making privileges dominant narratives and tends to silence marginalized others. The views of marginalized others on social reality, on our shared social reality. So we have a shared social reality that's hyper-diverse, and then it's narrowed down in the archives to the perspectives of those who are privileged to actually have access to archiving resources. I'm going to give an example. I kind of was in conversation about whether we use this example in Yale or not. I decided for the group that we're using the example. So there's going to be an example. Right now, we're not exactly on the, what does it mean for the lived realities, but that's coming. That's the next slide. So just to go back and say, conventional archives, libraries, museums, national archives, and even the press, nationalized press, which might not be such a theme in the North American space, but speaking from the German context, for example, we actually pay a certain tax that's for the press houses. So Rundfunkgebühr would be what it's called. It comes from radio still, and therefore there's certain the ARD and ZDF, the fast German TV, and the second one, they carry certain programs where we hope that our taxes are put to good use. That's what we're speaking about, nationalized press. I don't know if it's even an idea here in the North American context. So those archives are selective and they're rife with barriers. And their dominant-centric norms serve to silence and to erase the perspectives and the histories of groups with little social power. So marginalized groups, so LGBTQIA groups, trans groups, working class groups, disabled citizens, and those who are racially vulnerabilized tend to be rendered invisible. This limited archival documentation needs to be tackled by the institutions themselves. We need institutional answers, and it should not be pushed onto individuals. So it's not against individuals in the institutions working. They should do that work, but this is about fixing the institution. So we need the institution to take the responsibility so that when individuals who work on making archives inclusive move on to another institution, their knowledge and their expertise does not move on with them. The idea is that the institution itself is equipped and made and gets the capacity to be able to be more inclusive and to be more critical of exclusion. And institutions therefore need to question and to challenge the privileging of patriarchal archives, of heteropatriarchal archives, and of archival practices. And this is the article I was speaking about. So it's an article by Brenda Nyamandiko-Sanya and Anne Namatsi Lutomia, Archives and Collective Memories, Searching for African Women in the Pan-African Imaginary. It was a feature article in the 20th issue of the online journal Feminist Africa, Pan-Africanism and Feminism, which is also online. It's open access online. So you can download the whole feature article, or you can download the whole 20th issue. I have two more slides and I'm going to move on to our panel. So this is the example, and I brought this example because it happened here in this locality, in this geopolitical location. And I also brought it because we've been discussing this in the time in which I was unable to travel during the pandemic. This was 2020. When we began working on Zoom, I was working with my students on intersectional solidarity and actually trying to talk to them about how people from very different positionalities within the institution, they belong to the institution, they do work that's crucial for the institution to function. So the cleaning crews, we would not be able to sit in this room if the cleaning crew was not here, the technical crews, the food workers. So all these elements make the work possible that we do in this institution, and they have knowledge about the institution, but their knowledge does not make it into the archives. So I have no idea, prove me wrong. I would be happy for people to prove me wrong if this is in the archives of Yale. So 2016, Corey Menifee, a 38-year-old Black New Havener, and a cafeteria worker here at Yale, was arrested after smashing a stained glass window depicting enslaved people, idealizing the labor of enslaved people in a dining hall where he worked, and he used a broomstick. The broomstick part is very, is somehow very interesting to me. So I always say I am not advocating for destroying property. That's not the point I am making here. I'm taking this point as a crisis. It's a point of crisis. It's a commentary, and it's an analysis, and it's from embodied knowledge. So somebody who had been working in this institution for 10 years, at this point at which it happened, enacts an action which ensues in a crisis, and then goes down to the locker room and shaves, because this person also has the knowledge that being arrested in the embodiment in which this person is could be a risk to the person's life. And then something happens that there's solidarity from what I hear, I understand, from intersectional scholars, from legal studies within Yale, who then write, not only them, but they wrote letters and explained the situation, made it intelligible for the institution what happened here. And through this intersectional solidarity, the charges were dropped. And from what I understand, Corey Menefee got the job offered back. I was reading interviews. I could not read what happens from then. If Corey Menefee then took back the job and now belongs back to the institution, I couldn't read that part. So that's the point. The point I'm trying to make here is that I have no idea if this makes it into the conventional archives of Yale, if this is something that is taught as a point of crisis, not as an action to be emulated or to be repeated or to destroy property, but as a point of crisis from which we can learn from. We speak about a Lernchance, a chance for learning in subject-oriented knowledge production, coming with my education background. So that would be educational sciences background. So it's about critique and institutional transformation from the margins to the center. I'm citing Bell Hooks here. Her quote is on one of the following slides. And it's about the critique of the limited archival documentation and scholarship. I don't know if there's any scholarship here about this or any archival documentation. I do hear that this hall, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, the Calhoun Hall, something wrong there, that it's been renamed for a Black activist scholar, feminist, something. No, it's okay.
Programmer. Yeah.
Okay, it's been renamed. We will get into that. Thank you. We have some information here. It has been renamed. And what I'm trying to say is that there's limited documentation and limited circulation of the lived realities of people who have crucial knowledge to the institution, because they have an insight on how the institution functions on a level that those who don't have to do care work do not. I'm not saying we're not doing care work somewhere else, but we're not doing it as much. It's unequally distributed in this organization. And it's the same for my organizations and institutions I belong to in Berlin as well. So also for the Ministry of Education in Berlin. We see the racialized labor force, the post-migrant labor force very early in the morning, very late in the evening, and they're underrepresented during the day. But we can go into that later. So it's about intersectional solidarity and inclusively defined knowledge production and circulation. And to end this part of the frame, so this is the hook, the citation from Bell Hooks that I was talking about. We see the archive, I'm citing, beginning of the citation, we see the archive as a location for women and other groups with little social power, marginalized groups, to document their lived experiences. And we argue that archiving has great potential to build more inclusive records, histories, and also futures, bringing the margin to the center. So there is a need for African-led, female-led, and subaltern-led imaginaries, because these imaginaries then feed into archiving processes. And Sanya and Lutomia have hope because they're also reading text messages, Twitter feeds, Instagram feeds, and now also TikTok as forms of archiving and forms of forming a vast archive and a less controlled archive. And their potential to inform radically inclusive strategies for decentering dominant institutional norms and for creating more diversified and decolonized archives is also at the start of what we're trying to do with intersectional Black European studies. We are hopeful for the potential of intersectional Black European studies. We are hopeful for the potential of Black queer feminist scholarship and strategies to push the boundaries of who we think can belong. And that's the reference at the end. So I do have one last slide, but I'm going to go back to this one slide because I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Peggy Pischer. Would you like to stand? Would you like to?
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Maisha. And yeah, thank you, Fatima, for the invitation. Great that you all could join us today. I have some brief remarks about BEST, Black European Studies, which was already mentioned. So BEST was an international interdisciplinary project, which was founded together, which we founded together with Professor Sarah Lennox from the University of Massachusetts and Professor Randolph Oxman from the Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz. And its duration was between 2004 and 2007. It was funded by the Volkswagen Foundation, one of the bigger foundations in Germany, and supported by both universities, so in Mainz and Massachusetts, and later also being granted a grant from Alexander von Humboldt Foundation for this part then in the US. The goal of the project was to advance knowledge about the centuries-old history of Black Europeans, to bring together scholars from different disciplines who have previously worked mostly on their own in disciplinary isolation, and to advance the development of new theoretical and methodological tools for understanding the African diaspora in Europe. We imagined BEST as the institution that we missed in our own educational developments and academic environments. Black Europeans, their lives and works in past and present was mostly being perceived as alien to the concept of Europeanness and nation states. So this is also what we then encountered when we started to search for funding options for such a project. And Fatima EI-Tayeb at the time found the Volkswagen Foundation's new program. They called it the own and the other, or the own and the foreign. So that's a very typical research practice in Germany. And we got in contact with them and we said, oh, we would really fit very well with our project in that. And it took them a long time to really come around and understand that we mean that we could challenge exactly the notion of the own and the other, because they gave us examples over examples of how they fund projects on diversity and indigeneity everywhere in the world except for Europe or for Germany. So finally, they got around, but it was very clearly that their understanding of own and other was clear that we actually would, talk about Blackness outside of Europe. After being granted the funding, we organized an interdisciplinary conference, which we imagined as an intensive workshop with quite a few people in the field to map out the necessities and deepen the next steps. Together with scholars and activists such as Maisha Aouma, Philomena Assad, or Alexander Vihilea, and others at the conference, we focused on regional and interdisciplinary interests and started out mapping of Black European studies in Europe. The original plan was to continue to work in working groups together, but the interest in BEST and the call for this conference was really overwhelming, that we decided to organize another conference 1 year later. So we had to really reorganize the whole project plan. So this intensive workshop in Frankfurt became the first BEST conference. We called it Challenging Europe, Black European Studies in the 21st century. The second conference followed in 2006, Black European Studies in Transnational Perspectives, was in Berlin, and continued to address the African diaspora as part of intra-European history and put the exchange of ideas that has begun on a broader footing. But above all, our goal was to further the connectivity and transfer of knowledge between Black political movements and their academic work in Europe. So we got over 100 contributions, and they ranged in the topics of representing Black European history, networking strategies, international political organizations, racism and the academy, Black European studies curricula, and also empirical research subjects and objects. In 2007, we held a final gathering at UMass, wrapping up a 3-year-long project, which laid out a point of reference for a complex transdiasporic understanding of Black Europeanness. In the following years, it became a symbolic resource and, as Maisha always puts it, a school of thought. As BEST couldn't build on institutional foundations in most of the European countries, follow-up projects were quicker established overseas. With regard to publication pressures, for example, in academia, one could also say the institution took over. Our objective was to facilitate a space, a network, and to collect the production of transnational Black scholarship, all from the Black European point of view. This continued in different spaces, always in strong connection with Black feminist political movements and transdiasporic academic organizations, such as ADEFRA, the Black queer feminist collective in Germany, but also such as ASWAD, the Association of the Study of Worldwide African Diaspora, where Maisha Auma and myself have been or are right now board members. Finally, BEST works continues, one could say, with a new generation of scholars and activists as an archive now transforming into InBEST. InBEST, bringing together and centering the intersectionality, we try to start in BEST to crown that. As Katja always reminds us of, focusing on inclusion of not only the most privileged ones in our communities, we centered interdisciplinarity in the furthering of Black European studies in this new phase to come. And that would be the moment I will pass on to my friend and colleague, Katja Kenny, please.
Hello, everybody. Fatima, thank you for inviting us. We had a wonderful time here already. We met Fatima's 2 classes, and it's really a great experience. And Alicia, it was a great experience also to meet you. I just wanted to say that. And Fatima, it's very warm, feels like a very warm welcoming here. You can read who I am. The most important part I find is that I'm an activist for a long time. And even though where I earn my money is something different, but it has been very influenced by my activism and the themes I'm working on. I would like to begin with my part of the framework for this cooperation between Technical University of Berlin, Yale University, and the RRR Berlin. I will talk later about a little bit about my organization. Since 2018, Professor Maisha Auma, Peggy Piefe, and I have been advising the Berlin Senate, the state government of Berlin, within the framework of the UN Decade for People of African Descent. Our defined objectives are to dismantle anti-Black racism and to advance the equality of people of African heritage. Through this work, the RRR Berlin has installed a UN Decade section, which consists a total of 3 projects. One of those is a cooperation project, InBEST, Intersectional Best European Studies. The objectives for the RRR Berlin has one of the 3 cooperation partners is to understand the condition under which Black, Afro-diasporic, and African people study at the Berlin universities. We have 3. Our questions focus on the living conditions, both inside and outside the universities. To this day, there is little data on this matter, and data is one of the conditions to address, shift, and transform structural injustice. That's what we learned. The RA Berlin is a regional center for educational justice. We are an organization based in Berlin, consisting about 60 employees. They are all spread throughout the city of Berlin. We are funded on a federal, state, and communal level. In Germany, there are about 7 RAs agencies in total. Each one works different, independently, but all share a strategic partnership with the Freudenberg Foundation. Our primary concern is to achieve educational equity for marginalized groups, especially those experiencing racism in the areas of nurseries, schools, family centers, as well as in the area of political education organizations. The RA Berlin is a very diverse organization because we are working with the ethical implementation logic. The groups we work with must be reflected in our staff structures. The reason for this is that we work from a both diversity-oriented and a discriminational critical approach. Berlin ranks about 9th in Germany in terms of the diversity of its population, and yet the plurality of the city is not reflected in its institutions. This means that most institutions and organizations are predominantly white, including those organizations dealing with plurality, participation, and justice. In 2017 was funding from the German Federal Ministry for Family Affairs, Senior Citizen, Women and Youth. We developed the approach diversity-oriented organizational development to support organizations in becoming more diverse. And also critical of all forms of barriers and discrimination. The aim is to enable participation and justice, especially for people in the area of education. We are at an extremely high risk in our institutions of discrimination. Increasingly, our organization has developed methods to focus more and more on race equity and its intersections. To make it clear, the knowledge about exclusion and barriers is present in many institutions, along with a commitment to dismantle inequality. But the normalized barriers and the resulting exclusion still do not decrease. It seems, therefore, that the lack of diverse institutions is not a matter of cognitive knowledge about racism, sexism, or questions of class. In other words, it is essential to change, to focus also more on the emotional side of the problem of exclusion. Therefore, we take a reflexive approach in our transformation work. This approach allows us to look at structures, attitudes of organization, as well as perceptions of people, so that we are able to strengthen well-being with the understanding that our emotional corpus is part of our well-being. My main interest in our cooperation is therefore to develop a model for reflection. As I mentioned, to dismantle the condition of race-informed structures we live, work, study, and produce knowledge in, needs to address the emotional realities as well as a cognitive level. We need spaces of reflection for those who live every day in spaces which have toxic effects on them. And by that, I mean people who experience continuously and disproportionate devaluation, the devaluation that racism brings. Thank you.
So I will be the last. Thank you all for contributing, and
bringing you in. I have to thank you and Fatima to invite us, but you, because I'm like sitting on your shoulders, and you are so kind always to say I'm just with you, but I feel like I'm another generation, and I'm here because you are. So I want to thank you. Yeah, and that's how to create or talk about radical inclusive archives. I want to talk about how we can come to a publishing process. If we, like we heard, we are not in the institutions, we are not, there are no pictures about us, there is no, I don't know, no words for us and all of that. So we are radically excluded of the archives. And so how to deal with that and bringing it into publishing, that's a real big question, right? So I want to talk about this for short, because we decided to go in publishing with the publisher is established publisher in Germany. It's the Transcript Verlag. It's well, you can say they have some critical thoughts or impacts. And so we want to go publishing with them with we want to do I don't know how to say it.
A series.
A series, yes. Yeah, we will do that. So, but how to deal with that? And so I just thought about how to deal with that. And I wanted to come back to one article the three of you wrote in a oh, I lost my word. In a special issue, I just
Edited.
I edited, yes.
You really the columns.
Yeah, and you did like something radical archiving. And you did write about Afrikita. It's a Black feminist a journal back in 1890s. And so you just brought it in. It would be forgotten, but you brought it in. And so that's how we like to go further, bring things in and try to get all these voices, all these things who are not really in yet, try to get them in, and not just get them in while because there is paperwork about them, but it's like poems, it's like bodywork, it's like, I don't know, all these kinds of things who are excluded in the academy. So, and I wanted to talk about, how it is different to talk about radical exclusive archives in the US and from the EU context, from Germany at least. Not only since the protests of the Black Lives Matter movement, but already with confrontation of Pan-African globalization, critical Black movements, Black and anti-racist environmental movements, and movements against racism and state violence, it became clear that the exploitation and devaluation of Black lives is a global phenomenon, which specifically shows on the European continent. As an imperial aggressor and colonizer, the effects of domination emanated from Europe, the aftermath of which still affects us. At the same time, Europe, unlike the Americas, is not distinguished by settler colonial actions on its own continent. Therefore, the colonial and empirical grip could always be located and imagined outside, like Maisha always yeah, like Maisha said, Germany always talked about it's outside, it's in the US. Look at them, they are so, but at the same time, racialized attributions and regimes of oppression and violence derived from them did not become embodied in the European land and its people. Black enslaved people were indeed also trafficked in the imperial context of continental Europe. They were trafficked to Europe through colonial movements, exploitation, and profit maximization, or a status maker, as domestic servants in colonizers' households. But these stories are not told in the European context. The links between Europe and its imperial grip and colonial practices has changed over time. Currently, we are still dealing with neocolonial devaluations and exploitations that define the relationship. These relationships has involved a historical and ongoing devaluation of Black lives that is still specifically evident today in structural racism in a logic of exploitation of a global market, capitalism, in the recognition of denial of cultural goods, in the possibility of living and having a trustworthy life. Resistance already arose against enslavement and colonial encroachment. In addition to wars waged against the aggressor, it was also the small points, the everyday deprivation, the refusal of work, the protest, the collective resilience. Not only did the protesters and resistance movements have a global impact in this regard, but cultural practices that emerged from and within these protests continue to have a global impact today. For example, Black scholars point to Black Mediterranean that following the Black Atlantic illustrates the extent to which Black cultural and resistant products critique respective counter-narratives in dealing with exploitation and death. Just like the analysis of the forms of devaluation and exploitation, the counter-narratives in Europe are specific and different from those in the North American region and or the African, Caribbean, or South and Central American regions. Although connected to these two transnational movements, intra-European negotiations and contestations of the devaluation of Black lives are expressed specifically. What I want to say is we are in a specific way to talk about why Black Lives Matters in the European context. Thank you. And we have to explain that to publishers. That's why I'm explaining it to you. And that's why I try to sum it up right now. The series on European intersectional Black studies therefore turns to the specific focus on European struggles and tries to understand them in a broader field and beyond national boundaries. The series will publish books that can function as anthologies, monograph, or added volumes with a specific focus. The series is intended to represent an inter- and transdisciplinary approach to intersectional Black studies. In addition to the cultural studies, sociology, political theory, education, and philosophy, we would like to see contributions from political movements, action, and education practices. It is of great concern to us to conceive this series for, in, and with Black political movements. So I'm done.
All right, we are ready for Q&A.
Okay, do you want to go to that image?
To which one? This
This
one?
one, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, before we come to the Q&A, I totally forgot in the beginning to say that this series is supported by the Center for Race and Indigeneity and Transnational Migration, the European Studies Council, Kemp Foundation, and the Mellon Foundation. So thanks for the ability to bring all these people here. I refused to sit up with them, but now I still wanted to say something. Another thing that this project I think really wants to do is to see if it's possible to actually create a position for Black studies in Europe. So just to be very explicit, there is not a single department program for ethnic studies, Black studies, anything like that, Roma studies, anything like that, anywhere in continental Europe, which is ridiculous and very, very hard to change. I don't know if we'll be able to change it, but this is an ongoing struggle that is rooted both in the earlier Black European Studies project, but also in century-long activism. And to come back to that, what you see here is one of the activist intervention in the very much normalized European racism, which is, for example, reflected in street names. The name of this street translates into Moor Street, which in German is a term for Black people, derogatory term for Black people, but it also indicates a somewhat different constellation of Blackness in Europe, which is closer intersecting with the history of Muslims. And Audre Lorde is relevant for the German context because as a Black feminist, when she came to Germany, she immediately looked for Black Germans, just assuming that they would be there. And that was actually very unusual. It's still unusual. It's still somewhat frustrating to hear from Black people in the US. Oh, I didn't know that there are Black people in Germany. Yes, we are everywhere. And one last example that I wanted to give you, I don't know if any of you ever heard the name Wilhelm Anton Amo. Excellent. So this was a Black German, originally from what is now Ghana, brought to Europe, to Germany as an enslaved domestic servant who ended up studying philosophy, earning a doctorate in philosophy, writing his dissertation on the topic of slavery. Yale, the Yale Center for the Study of Slavery has a fellowship named after him in collaboration with a German university program on, what is it called? Slavery and
Pregnancy studies.
It's not only slavery and
Oh, okay.
yes. So there's no, as I said, there's
Someone
no
come and get me.
program for Black studies in Germany, but there is a program for slavery and
This
independence
Hungary.
studies. This fellowship is for scholars working on slavery in the United States. They can go to Germany to this institution to study US slavery. Yeah, this is a completely white program. I will definitely talk to that center about that fact, but it's very illustrative, I think, of the topic that we are addressing here, that the history of Black Germans is either completely suppressed or appropriated in a way that leads to a second erasure. So it's a very violent process. Not to focus exclusively on this violence, but the Europe and the US, Europe is amazing in its ability to produce successful propaganda. And one effect of that is there's often a sense that racism, if present in Europe, is somewhat milder than it is here. That is not the case. It is different. But it has led to this erasure that we are challenging. Yeah, so if you have any follow-up questions, comments, we have time for that.
I have a question about the archive
Yes.
as like a particular place. Is this actually housed either as a physical archive or a virtual archive in one place? Or because a lot of archivists now talk about post-custodial archiving, community archiving, where archivists maybe at institutions help communities, whether it's, an activist group or a larger group, think about their records and preserving them such that it's still in their control, versus trying to bring things together so that you have kind of a stable place, whether it's real or virtual, for future research. I'm just curious, kind of more the practical side of how this works as an archive. And related to that, especially with, archiving digital material. So say you want to collect Twitter or Facebook or of a particular group, there's just an enormous amount of stuff. So at some point you have to make a selection, just like archivists always have to. So where does that selection happen, and how do you manage that?
Yes. Are we answering directly or someone here?
No, answer directly.
Okay, so I'd like to do two things. I'd like to say something about your context. It was really important context, and then I can say try and answer the question. You gave really important context. Also, I had no clue about this, because that comes to the point of devaluation that Katja is talking about, that the work of Anton Wilhelm Amo as his body of work as a philosopher, because his work was called The Rights of Blacks, or something, in Europe, the rights of Blacks in Europe. So really important work for us, and it's lost. That the official narrative, the official statement is that his work is lost. We don't have this work, and I'm not going to name the other philosophers in his time whose works are there in a very large extent. I'm not making their work smaller. Their work is a good option. Every work is an option because we need a multi-perspective option, but it's telling that certain options of racialized academics and scholars, work which would have been really interesting for us, is lost. And there's a sculpture. I took a picture of Peggy at the University of Halle because that's where he did his dissertation. We were there in, I think, 2010s or something. And there's a sculpture of Anton Wilhelm Amo. And I'm glad that there's a sculpture, but the sculpture is a sculpture of him half naked. So it's basically, yes, it's the Lendenschutz, and what you call this, the wrapping or whatever it's called. There's layers of devaluation there. So that's what I wanted to say about the archives. And then to your question, thank you for your question. We are really at the beginning of trying to form these archives under this framework of intersectional Black European studies. There's certain parts of the archive that are already very, they're curated already as a body of work. For example, Peggy's work on East Germany, on Blackness in East Germany. There's photo documentation, very specific, and East Germany is interesting. It was 40 years of GDR, by the way, for the younger people who didn't get the whole Cold War, because they're like, what happened? What wall? That wall. And that's a specific example, that there's private photographs of contract workers, but also of students from the opposition, so First World, Second World, and the so-called Third Worlders. And then the GDR was in Kenya, for example, and one of the leaders of the opposition, Raila Odinga, studied in East Germany, in Magdeburg, and then in East Berlin. And then the SWAPO and the ANC, who also studied in East Germany. And there's archives of their lives and their exchanges, and also of their alliances in East Germany. And so one of the photographs, one of Archiv Güter, archival goods, no, I don't know what you would call it, archival material, is actually private photographs of very many people who are either descendants of these contract workers, of the opposition, of the freedom fighters, of the political opposition, and so on, Cuba, Vietnam. So it's also, it's Black people, but it's also people of color, BIPUC. And what I learned, there's macro politics of the exchanges between the opposition, but there's also micro politics within the schools, the School of Friendship in Stassfurt, where we have youth who photograph themselves in part, and also people who are very known within the, I'm going to call it village, but it's not a village, it's a small town. They were known in the small town to make very good photographs, so they were always called into parties, exchanges, to take pictures. And the last thing I'm going to say is I didn't realize this. A long part of my work, academic work in Germany, has been in the East, in Saxony-Anhalt, in Magdeburg-Stendal, where I just stopped last year, and still working there in research. Every company, every very small company had a diary. I had no idea about this, a Betriebstagebuch. And the GDR has a tradition of writing in diaries. So the whole week about what happened in that company is written into this book. So we are trying to access. There's also these documents that people are now contributing, what do you call it, donating to archives, or they're giving them away, or just throwing them away, basically. And we're trying to get those archives before they're thrown away. So that's one archive. Another archive would be Fazia Jansen. Fazia Jansen is a Black queer feminist union organizer who has lines. Was she herself in an internment? In Neuengamme, was he selber interniert? She also survived an internment, a KZ, a concentration camp. And she organized in union union context, and there's a Fazia Jansen archive. And then there's a Vera Hoyer archive, who is also a community activist from Frankfurt am Main, who died really early in her 60s, but she left an extensive collection of Black literature, which she had collected, and it became the basis of the Each One Teach One archive in Berlin. So that's what we're speaking about, but we're also speaking about the text that we wrote in the Femina Politica, in the online journal that Denise Bergold-Caldwell and Vanessa Thompson, who's also a Black German, in collaboration with a white German feminist, Martina Löw. They had in 2021 a special issue on Black feminisms, and we took the chance, Peggy, Katja, and myself, because we have been working together for over 30 years in this context, to write about this magazine that has not been digitized enough. Katja had all copies. Katja used to sell them. This was when we had flyers, and Katja still has her list, her little book where she wrote how many she sold and stuff. And there's exactly 6 copies in the one of the most important transformation processes in Germany, 89 to 90. So it's actually this process of, Peggy says, of unification. I'm going to say the wrong word, of unification, that is also documented. Also the Black queer feminist groups in East Germany, they're writing letters to them with post office boxes. This is how old this stuff is. And Katja had all 6 copies, and she gave them to someone, but because she was selling them, she at least had 3 more copies of the even issues, and all the odd issues. Now we're searching for them together in archives in Berlin, so we can digitize them. And Fatima is going to be coming in summer, will be coming to Berlin in summer from the 1st of January to the 21st of January around, so we can digitize some of this stuff. So that's what we're talking about. When we're speaking about different copy, this is what we're talking about. Yes. I hope it answers your question somewhat.
Oh, there are more answers here.
Yes, go ahead.
Just to add to that, all of these different archives Maisha mentioned right now, they are spread out in Germany. So one part of the project is also to bring that together, or to facilitate a space where people also in the future, because when they are deciding I'm moving to a smaller place, or thinking about my heritage, who do I give that to, that they can give it into a space where Black scholarship is possible, and where also the younger generations can access that. That's already happening with the Vera Hoyer archive, which is in Each One Teach One, so a Black community space and a Black library in this sense. But we're also talking about the ADEFRA archive, which is basically literally in my cellar. Yes. And the question you're raising, that is what we are dealing with as we speak. So to sort it out, to preserve it, I mean, how many years can you have something in the cellar? And also with moving since 20 years around,
Say something about Wasser in der Wüste, because it's your archive.
Yeah. And so there are a lot of archives in private sense where people already felt the need. We need to preserve them for future references, and even we don't know exactly what to do with it or how to transform it. So I started a couple of years, 20 something
More
years
than
ago.
20. More than 20.
Exactly. To collect
In the 90s.
final writings, Abschlussarbeiten, theses,
Yeah. Master thesis.
master theses, which are not published in Germany, from the Black community. Because in the time we also had in our community gatherings that we exchanged these theses also for other Black students to work with that, because we could not access that, as you also mentioned that, Denise, in our academic environments. So I collected these theses. Always with the idea to bring that together and publish that together, because it was alienated from the canon, from the canonic knowledge in many fold. So as Black produced work, knowledge, and theses which would not be included into the curriculum. But it is very important, not only to us, as we see now, that it is especially community embedded knowledge productions. So that's all. It's actually at the same time we have to access all of these questions now, and InBEST hopefully will widen the space that we can include and save all of these archives. And some of them, especially what you talked about, the one from East Germany, we also have to save it and get it back from hostile environments, in a sense. So I say that now, since some of the archival material is being given to large, big archivists, like in West Germany at a museum, where now you can access material of Black lives in East Germany. That makes no sense. It's crazy, But but it's like always, we don't have a space, so it's moving to the West. So now we're creating a space, and we will find ways to get it out of the Western colonization.
Got yourself.
And to come back to the more practical aspects of your questions, and as I told you before, we started, you'll hear a lot more about it. We have a project that will bring 6 grad students from Yale to Berlin in the summer to start archiving, but the idea is not necessarily to be able to archive everything, but to create a kind of manual for people to use, because with digital archiving, you basically just need a smartphone. So what we would hope to do in the fall with an undergrad class is to produce both the beginning of the online archive, and as you said, it's very important for us to save materials before they are destroyed, before they are thrown away, but not to bring them to a place like Yale, but leave them where they are accessible to the communities that produce them, and also create a kind of how-to guide that would allow people, because this is a situation that exists everywhere, right? To allow people in Italy, in Romania, to digitize materials, Black histories, to make sure that even if the physical material is lost, there are traces left. And what we would like to do is to cooperate and use the experience of people like you, but not have an institution like Yale own that material. So this is something that's very important to us, because we understand that this is just a beginning, but I think one of the advantages of digitization of online communication is that it could be a kind of amplifier for people elsewhere to do similar things. Are there more questions?
We have an online question from Francesca Pullman, who said, "Thank you all so much. I love the work you do. My question is, when can I study intersectional Black studies?"
It's an awesome question.
Yeah. So many people ask that.
Yeah.
We hope soon. We're working hard on it.
Yeah.
We are working hard on it. Let me say something that's not very hopeful, but I'm still going to say it. So projects of radical inclusivity and also just trying to achieve more equity or Gerechtigkeit, yeah, justice. They go in they have conjunctions, conjuncturen. They have conjunctions, they have like places where a lot of things happen, and then places where they kind of like have to deal with a lot of setbacks. And since the organization of the federal structure in Germany, education is an issue for each of the 16 states. And within the decade for people of African heritage from 2015 to 2024, the Berlin government in 2016 and again in 2021 prioritized the implementation of equality of people of African heritage and also a dismantling anti-Black racism. And Berlin, unfortunately, we had the marathon, but unfortunately we had elections on the same day as the marathon, so we botched up the last elections of the coalition of 2021, and we had to re-elect in February. And then my beef with non-voters, people, the voting turnout went down. And that usually means that inclusive politics, when people don't vote, those politics go into recession, thank you. They go into recession. So that's where we are right now, that we are at the end of the UN decade, that Berlin as the only state in 2016, again in 2021, in the coalition contract, prioritized dismantling anti-Black racism and equality pushing equality for Afro-diasporic people. And when we speak of intersectional Black studies, we think it in solidarity with other BIPOC, with other racially vulnerabilized groups. So we always think the group that pushes for more intersectional racism critique, right? Also it's this one group, Afro-diasporic people, but it's meant to be to create an infrastructure, racismuskritische Infrastruktur and racism critical infrastructure. And at this point, we do not know. So we have a new coalition, and this new coalition has just released their coalition contract. And guess what's missing? Anti-discrimination policies, the UN decade is missing. So we are in a period of, I would say, again, Afro-pessimistic analysis, where we are hospicing forms of being that are outdated. Berlin, the population in Berlin until 6 years is hyper diverse. It's people of color, so the future is tending towards people of color being the majority. And yet we do not have the policies in place that take that into account, that we are hyper diverse and post-migrant society. So to the person asking the question, Francesca, I'm very sorry that at this point, we are probably going to have to be working. We work despite the conjunctions and the recessions. We just keep working. And we hope that in your generation, you will at least be able, I hope you're very young, so you'll be able to maybe study a master's or do your PhD in intersectional studies, because that's what's going to be happening. But the community-based knowledge production always continues. And Peggy didn't say it, I was trying to prompt her, because this body of work that she collected, she was going to, it was a thesis done in the 80s and 90s, and she gave it the title Water in the Desert, Wasser in der Wüste, which is a citation from a poem by Guy Nzinga St. Louis, one of the first non-conforming Black queer feminist statements. She wrote a book called Poems from a Beautiful Woman. And Peggy was going to do an anthology in the 90s. And because we do not have the institutional resources, this material was in Peggy's cellar. And then Peggy gave this material to an archive who also does not have the resources. And Peggy is now going back and forth in Berlin trying to get back all her work so we can use it for this work. So it's a little bit depressing to say that that's where we are. The part that's not depressing is that as we are sitting here, we have been working for 30 years together, Katya and Fatima for over 30 years. So we're here. That's the thing. And we are an archive in ourselves, so to speak. But the institutional part is missing. So it's a very long, rambling answer to that question. I hope it's a young person, because if you're young, you might be able to do your master's thesis in intersectional Black European studies. And if you're not, we'll find a way to work on the community-based part of the project together, I hope. Yes, Roy. Hi.
Thank you, Alicia, and everyone for your contribution today. I wanted to ask two questions. So the first one is who or what groups or people, activists, organizations that you look to in other parts of Europe, and why, or what other who else informs your work, and even beyond Europe. And then I wanted to maybe hear more about this person who of Ghanaian extraction who did the PhD. Like, when was this? How did you discover this person? What's the current status in Germany in regards to trying to find out more information on this person? And I heard that his PhD dissertation is missing.
Yes.
Yes. Which is very interesting. So I wonder what your theorizations are around that.
Yes. I'm going to risk it and say early 18th century was when Anton Wilhelm Amo was writing.
30s.
Okay, good. Because I'm really bad at history, but
There's even a translation of some of it by Justin Smith.
oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not the dissertation. Most dissertations were oral at that time, so never else have been written down.
Understood. Okay, so we can work around that about how.
Other of his works are around on human diversity,
That's good.
even translation. I can give you the reference.
We also want them. Send them around, please. That's a circulation part.
And I mean, it's a good transition to your other question, because when we did the first Black European Studies conference in the early 2000s, our goal was to bring together scholars who actually were in Europe, who never had a chance to meet each other. The only way to meet really transnationally in Europe is in the US. And that remains a problem. So very often you have scholars, especially, but not only, from Eastern Europe, who are literally the only ones, and who often don't have the resources to ever meet someone else, and certainly have nobody to work with in their institutions. So there's this kind of isolation that is also a reflection of the fact that the US, thanks to the civil rights movement and other revolutionary movement, was forced. The US institutions were forced to open up to a certain extent to racialized populations. And that also opened up to people like me, racialized European, who found a job in the US, not in Europe. But it also means that there is a very one-sided circulation of information. So for many people working on not only Blackness, but generally race in Europe, the only way to actually make a living of that is to come to the US or to Canada. And very often you only slightly recognized by white Europeans once you have an affiliation with a US institution. So one of our ongoing goals is to reactivate this collaboration that often happens on the activist level, certainly among feminist activists, also among queer activists. You have a kind of transnational communication in Europe that is ongoing, but often again also not archived. When I lived in the Netherlands, for example, there was a queer of color organization called Strange Fruit, active from the late 80s to 2000, very important, but a new generation of queer of color archivists in the Netherlands have no idea that they existed. So creating an archive, and as you said, we are all kind of living archives, is both to remind ourselves that we have a history, but also to create connections both horizontally among different communities, dispersed communities, but also in terms of generations. So I think what we try to do is to not only look what has been published mostly in English, mostly in the US, but also things that are hard for us to access. If there are Black Polish groups that have published flyers in Polish, I can't read them. So the question of language is also something, and of translation is also something that makes our work more complicated, but also the resources more interesting, really.
I just ask why, what you feel the reason is as to why when scholars come to America, suddenly in Europe, then they listen, or, you know, it's a bit different. They start to respect them more, you know, maybe listen a bit more. Why do you think that is?
Because I think for one thing, one of my students said her mother always says no one likes their own Negroes. So if you're, you know, if you're removed, then you're in a different position.
Yeah.
I should say that a Black student of mine, just to be.
No, that was clear. That was clear. I was catching to the heart though.
Yeah.
I was absolutely scared.
That's a good point.
Okay, are there any more questions? We would have time for one more question.
Have there been student mobilizations to create anything like that? Because that's why we exist.
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. I can start. Oh, you want to start?
I was exactly. Let me start.
Yes,
You
yes.
can, put it in a larger context and bring it back to the university, because I would start by there has been a lot of protest from out the community, you know, for decades and decades. And my first response to your question would be, you know, we are so busy protesting every single thing, you know, which is kind of, you know, throwing over our knowledge productions, you know, like what in Augsburg, you know, when they in a zoo 20 years ago wanted to rival the idea of the Völkerschau, you know, putting Black people in a zoo and then finding, you know, that very attractive to enhance business, you know.
It was called
So
an African village.
An African village, you know. So that was, for example, where the young Black community raised so much protest. And again, that would also support what you were saying, you know. When we started to activate our transnational diasporic connections, then they were flattered, you know, not flattered, they were flooded with all protests, and then they started to listen to us, you know. Or when a white academic in Bremen started, you know, the first white-Black studies, where we also, you know, as the community with all of this Black knowledge productions for decades, you know, protested and said, you know, you cannot do that. You cannot set you in the beginning of something which is going on for decades and actually longer, and which is community-informed knowledge productions. And there again, you know, our transnational collaborations helped to shut that down. So I would say, and there were always, you know, students involved, and so we are busy on so many fronts that there is probably not something like what we know from UK or the US or from South Africa, for example, over the last couple of years. But yes, there have been also particularly protests and a lot of work being done by Black and POC students at the universities, and Maisha was there much more
I can say two things. Also, one, Alicia, it's a very important point, because from what I understand, San Francisco State and so on was really like out of protest, out of the power of students to say they want a Black Studies department, to start from somewhere. That's really the history of many of the departments. One, I think we're missing the historical moment. I may be wrong, but I think that took place in the wider context also of maybe the 60s, a movement, a place where the institutions are getting it from all sides to kind of transform, and maybe a moment similar or the similar dynamic can happen again. I'm nostalgic sometimes about those moments of revolution, but that could be really, that's imprecise, but I think that might have something to do with it. What has definitely happened that Peggy has also pointed out is there've been, I'm going to say certain coalitions. For example, there was a blog at one of the Berlin universities which began to document all of the racism relevant occurrences that happen within academia. And it opened a bigger conversation, but it also died off after 5 years when the students graduated and then moved on to somewhere else, which we always see that's what happens when individuals are somewhere. And some of the students couldn't finish their studies at that university because now they were so exposed also, especially if they were BIPOC, then they couldn't go into the anonymous masses. And then at the Humboldt University, there was a lot of action, mostly around the gender studies, where they said they want a Black professor. And then now comes the two lines I was trying to say. This is also speculative, but the organization of the German Academy that is not departmental, but you get a chair, and when you get the chair, you appoint people in that chair. If you disagree, I have had people who, I did my PhD with a grant from the Heinrich Böll Foundation, but if you did it within a project and you disagree within that project, then your PhD is over, even if it's almost finished, and then you have to look for a new theme. So these structures of having this you get the chair, and then from the chair, everything else is organized. That makes the thing I was talking about, normalizing exclusion practices, very, very virulent. So all kinds of things can happen there. There's also the hashtag #MeToo in science, if the hashtag #MeToo in laboratories. All kinds of oppression and discrimination can happen, organized along that chair, and it's very, very hard to get the department to take action. We already know how hard it is to get anyone to take action, and that's a critique to myself also. Where I always think, what is the action going to mean if I start as the only Black person here? I'm going to start taking action because someone has reacted. So there's that. And the other thing I want to say, the point well taken, no one likes their own Negroes. It's true that there's certain exceptionalism about someone coming. We don't have that here, but we're looking for someone to bring them from there to here. And that's a dynamic. We have it in Austria. We have it in Germany. It's always just this bringing in, and you don't understand the whole capacity of what's going on in that place. So you can't, you don't have the capacity to cut through like you would if you understand what's going on. And now I'm going to say something nice about the US. And that's why I said this before, just to make clear that I'm not saying it's really, really super nice and everything, but I think the department structures, I think there's a higher capacity to incubate, to be more innovative, like just to write out a professorship and say maths, and then anyone can come, not anyone, I know not anyone can come, but people can come in and actually pitch something about stochastic or something. And in Germany, it's an enzyme. So every chair that's written is one enzyme. If you miss that one thing, didn't work on it, then it means that the potential for the existing system to exclude you because they say, you're so great, but this enzyme is missing, damn. And then at the end, it's a couple of people from a certain demographics who are more compatible with this enzyme. And I feel that that's more open here. So the leaky pipe is not as strong. In Germany, it's just a deluge. It's just already out. You're in and you're already out. And here you can stay a bit longer maybe. And the last thing I'm going to say, which is also a nice thing, is that, and maybe it's not true in Yale. It's my first time in Yale. I come to the States like once a year, but I've never been to New Haven. So I have no idea what the technicalities are here, but the idea that you can speak any kind of English and teach stochastics with any kind of English is also very open. So the metropoles in New York, you speak all kinds of English and you get along. In London, you do speak also most kinds of English. Maybe in the academic field, it's not as open as the US. I'm going to take London out of the equation because I think you can work in something else, but probably not in academia. Germany, there's this idea that you have to speak a certain kind of German. And job opportunities, not only academia, are so narrowed down. It's not about communication as a tool and being able to put things across and have these stochastic ideas. I know academics, Katya also from Kenyan academics, for example, who worked on stochastics. That's why I'm really bad at math, but this person was really good at it. So and good at saying you don't have to be literate. You need to be literate, but you also need to be numerate. So I am barely numerate. Okay, I am numerate, but I'm not like math is just really bad. I barely went to statistics in my education society. I'm disclosing too much. I shouldn't say this, but this person was so good at explaining maths. A Kenyan academic, Anthony Owino was his name. Unfortunately, through illness, died very early. But this person was able to work, and he came from PhD in Cambridge and so on. Came to work in Berlin and Potsdam without speaking a word of German, and it was possible to work. And that's the rare exception. So apparently the mathematicians are doing something that the rest of the disciplines are not doing because they narrow down. So you have to have the enzyme and you have to speak a certain German. Yeah, then we're going to have the same demographics forever, more or less. So that's an attempt to understand how the student-led movements, because they're there, and the Black Students Union just formed a complaint, and we're working with Sarah Ahmed's book Complaint to understand what their complaint was addressed towards Africa and Asian studies, their under-regional studies. So this was just last year, basically, and then it goes nowhere because it just sinks into the morass of this chair structures of a very limited demographic. Sorry, very rambling answer, but I'm going to think that that's what's going on.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all.
And also to the people of Zoom.
Yes, yes. So let's have some lunch.